I'm Wendy. I still remember the day when the truth finally came out, shattering the false facade of the wealthy family I was once a part of. The annual policy holder meeting at Sterling Insurance was supposed to be a display of strength and stability, but it turned into a nightmare for them. I sat near the back of the large ground floor hall, watching as Vivian, my ex-mother-in-law, stood at the podium. She was dressed in her finest, a string of pearls around her neck, and the overpowering scent of her perfume filled the air. The room was filled with rows of folding chairs, mostly occupied by gray-haired policy holders, some leaning on canes. A banner with the company's 100-year seal hung on the wall, and a couple of local reporters were present, drawn by the solvency rumors. Vivian began her speech with her usual warm, unhurried voice of inherited authority. She thanked the loyal policy holders and dismissed the rumors as the work of competitors and cynics. She promised a record year, repeating the word strong 4 times, which made me scoff internally. Then, the side door opened, and 2 people entered. One was a woman in a plain suit with a state lanyard and a leather folder, and the other carried a banker's case of documents. It was the examiner from the state insurance department. Vivian's sentence trailed off at the podium. The examiner introduced herself and stated, in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, that following a financial examination of Sterling Insurance, the commissioner had petitioned the court, and the company was being placed under the department's supervision effective immediately, with new business suspended pending further proceedings. A murmur ran through the room like wind through a field. The policy holders looked worried, and the board members went rigid. Vivian stood frozen at the podium, the record year speech still half in her mouth. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had known this day would come. It all started when I met my ex-husband, Ethan. I'm an actuary. I've spent years sitting in quiet rooms, calculating the risks and values that insurance companies need to know. My father was a small-town insurance agent. He taught me that the numbers don't lie, people do. Learn the difference. His words stuck with me, and I've always been calm and accurate in my work. I met Ethan at an industry conference. He was charming, and I was naive enough to mistake his ease for warmth. He told me his family ran a long-term care insurance company, Sterling Insurance, which his late father had built. We got married within 18 months. I kept my job and my maiden name out of habit. The first time I visited the Sterling family mansion, I knew I didn't belong there. Vivian greeted me with a cold smile that never reached her eyes, and the whole house smelled of her overbearing perfume. Her husband, Henry, had died years ago, but his portrait hung over the stairs, as if still watching over the family. Vivian ruled the company and the family with an iron fist. Ethan did whatever she said. For 3 years, I tried to fit in. I was pleasant and forgettable at their dinners, focusing on my work and my marriage. I thought the coldness was just a part of the old money family. But then, I got pregnant. Vivian started to show a different side. She would rest her hand on my belly without asking and talked about the twins as the next generation of the Sterling family. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't know why. I'm good at reading risk. I noticed that Ethan started working late, and his tone on the phone changed. Then, money started to disappear from our joint account. When I asked him about it, he said it was a company thing and wouldn't look me in the eye. I did what I do best, I hedged. I opened a separate account and moved some money into it. I made copies of our financial records and kept them in a safe place. I even started reading Sterling Insurance's public filings at night, telling myself it was just a nervous habit. The twins were born on a Tuesday. They were 2 beautiful girls, 8 minutes apart. I named them Lily and Rose in the delivery room before anyone could object. Ethan was in a meeting when I went into labor and stuck in traffic when they were born. He arrived late, smelling of someone else's perfume, and held the girls like they were a burden. My old mentor, Martha, was the one who held my hand through the whole process. She was a retired actuary who had worked in a state regulator's office. She drove an hour to be with me and didn't leave. When the nurse asked for the names on the birth certificates, I gave the girls my last name. It was a small, stubborn act, but it felt right. For 3 days, it was just me and the girls in the hospital room. I memorized every little thing about them, the way one fussed and the other watched, and how they both quieted when I hummed off key. I thought the worst was behind me, but I was wrong. 3 days after giving birth, Vivian walked into my hospital room. Behind her was Ethan and a young woman I'd never met, carrying a diaper bag as if she already owned the place. A man in a gray suit followed, carrying a folder. Vivian sat on the edge of my bed and uncapped her black fountain pen. The click was the loudest thing in the room. "Take $22 million and sign these papers," she said. "I only want the children." I looked at the divorce papers and the relinquishment form. I looked at my girls in my arms. And then, I made a decision. I signed the papers, but not in the way they expected. I knew that a paper signed on a hospital bed was not a court order. A real surrender of parental rights needed to be made under oath before a judge. And nobody could actually buy a child. A court would decide based on the best interest of the child. So, I signed slowly, making them think I was giving in. Then, I picked up my girls and walked out of the room. I waited until visiting hours were over and called Martha. She was in the parking garage in 20 minutes. We drove to a furnished apartment in another town that I had leased a month earlier under my own name. On the way, I drafted a letter in my head to revoke the relinquishment I'd signed under duress. The next morning, their lawyer found that the relinquishment was invalid. Vivian called me and tried to be reasonable, but I told her I was keeping my daughters and her money. I knew I couldn't just rely on the invalidity of the papers. I needed to find a way to make sure they couldn't take my girls away. So, I started to dig deeper into Sterling Insurance. I pulled out the copies of their statutory filings that I had made before. I started to read them the way my father taught me, slowly and suspiciously. And I found something that made my stomach turn. Sterling Insurance was selling long-term care insurance, but their reserves were dangerously thin. Their loss assumptions were overly optimistic, and their lapse rates were unrealistic. They were promising far more care than they had the money to pay for and reporting the gap as profit. I needed proof. Among the financial records I'd copied, I found an internal asset adequacy worksheet from Ethan's home office. It showed a huge gap between the reserve the company had filed with the state and the reserve it actually needed. And there were Ethan's initials and those of the company's appointed actuary. I knew this was a lead, but I needed to build a solid case. I went to Martha for help. She taught me the process of bringing a solvency concern to the state insurance department. If the concern was valid, the commissioner could open a financial examination, and if the reserves were found to be inadequate, the company could be placed under supervision. I used some of the $22 million to buy the time and tools I needed. I rented a quiet office and spent nights rebuilding Sterling Insurance's true reserve position from the ground up using only public filings. Before I filed my complaint, Ethan found me. He tried to be the loving husband, then the negotiator, and finally, he showed his true colors, telling me to stop digging. It was clear he was more afraid of what I'd find than losing the twins. Vivian came to me last. She met me at a coffee shop and told me about how Henry had built the company from scratch and how she'd tried to keep it afloat when the reserves started to go thin. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then, she reminded me that the girls were Sterling's and that I was just a line item. That was when I decided to file my complaint. I packaged my analysis into a formal report and sent it to the state insurance department. I did it calmly, knowing that I had the truth on my side. The department moved quickly. Within weeks, they opened a financial examination of Sterling Insurance. The company's value started to shake, and the rumors spread. The young woman, Olivia, who had come to the hospital with Vivian, was the first to leave. She had bet her future on the Sterling name, but when the company started to crumble, she disappeared. Ethan was mired in a fraud investigation, and Vivian was desperate. She summoned me to the annual policy holder meeting, thinking she could still control the situation. But as I stood in the meeting room, watching the examiner deliver the news, I knew the game was over. I walked to the front of the room, calm and steady. "I told you, I don't get loud. I get accurate," I said quietly. "You said I was never family, just a line item. You were right. So I read the whole ledger, and the line that doesn't balance is yours." The policy holders gasped. A woman in the front row asked the question that had been on my mind for months: "Is our care money safe?" I told them the truth. I explained that the company had not set aside enough to keep all its promises, but the state supervision was a rescue. I stood between the frightened policyholders and the family that had gambled them. After that, the wall came down quickly. Sterling Insurance went into formal rehabilitation, and the family's paper fortune evaporated. The trust that Vivian had fed for decades faced clawback. The mansion slipped out of her hands, and Henry's name was associated with fraud in every regional headline. The custody question was easily resolved. A judge ruled that Lily and Rose would stay with me, as their father was involved in a fraud investigation and I was a stable and present mother. My settlement held, and I even became an outside consultant for the court-appointed receiver, using my knowledge to ensure that the claims of the policyholders were still paid. I took back my own name, and now, it's just me, Lily, and Rose. They thought the dangerous one was the one with the money and the lawyer, but they never considered the quiet woman in the hospital bed who knew that numbers, like children, were never theirs to buy. And in the end, calm got the last word.